Science is not a pure truth-seeking activity. It is a greedy, corrupt, money and laudatory-seeking institution.
Hello and welcome to the Gopherwood Lounge. I am Arc Press Senior Editor DJ Butler. Come on in out of the rain. Before we jump into the actual interview today, let me remind you to like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, go to arc.press and sign up for the mailing list, and follow us on X. Our handle there is arc_press, all of the usual stuff. Today we're here with we're just starting to interview authors. We've had Larry on a few times, but everyone knows Larry. So we're just starting to really interview our authors. And this is one of our first authors and one of our first interviews. I want to welcome Travis Corcoran to the lounge. Travis, hello.
Howdy, cool. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, we're excited to get you on here and really just have kind of a get to know you conversation for the benefit of me and also for our audience. You are in New Hampshire, is that right?
That is right, which is a statutory requirement for part of one of my jobs, which is I am a New Hampshire state rep. I am one of the 420 most powerful people in New Hampshire, which is a fraction of 1% and runs down to zero. But yeah, they would look askew if it turned out that I was over the line in Vermont or Massachusetts. So here in New Hampshire, I am. And as I say in some of the various bios floating around, I escaped from the People's Republic of Massachusetts about 12 years ago. Through contacts and coyotes, got myself smuggled over the border, and I live on a farm up here in New Hampshire. And again, as I say in the bios, with 3 or 4 metalworking lathes and 10,000 books, and I've got a herd of sheep and my wife and dogs, and so that is where I am and what I'm up to.
Well, what a fantastic description. Let me start with the 10,000 books. That's so wonderful. I have a ton of books myself. I'm sitting here in a room surrounded with probably a couple thousand, and is one of several in my house. In fact, we got moved to London and then moved back from London by an employer. And the guys who were packing our house when we moved back from London were bitching the whole time about how many books we had. because a guy came to like sort of summarize what there was.
Yes.
To do, did not appreciate the
no, and that's a perennial thing. They have an eye like, okay, 1 table, 6 chairs, not too many sofas and throw cushions. Great, I got it. And books just sort of read visually, almost like a tapestry on the wall. They don't get it. And
Right.
Then their guys are, whether you boxed them up or they're boxing it up, just the infinite boxes, each of them weighing 600 pounds up and down the stairs. And they get themselves in trouble.
Right. Very unhappy. So fortunately I tip. 10,000 though, that's great. That's now, is that an inherited library at all? Or are you just a determined collector all your life?
The word collector is a little fraught because it can mean a bunch of things. It can mean poser or something.
You read, that's your point. You actually read them.
I've been absolutely voracious reader since early childhood. During a brief stint in childhood, from 2nd through 4th grade, I was down in Mississippi. And I think it was, probably around 2nd grade. The first science fiction novel I ever read was a YA, Heinlein's The Red Planet. And I didn't even know that science fiction existed as a genre, and this is, I don't know, it might have been literally pre-Star Wars, and the media landscape is just entirely different. And, if there's any, young people, 20s, even 30s listening, of course, there's, MCU, and there's tons of movies, and there's 1,000 video games, and, that's just the world you live in. But science fiction was this, strange little ghetto thing. So anyway, there I am as, a 7-year-old. And I picked this up because it says The Red Planet, which I know is related to Mars. There's a little sticker on the cover, with a symbol, a 1950s atom on it. And I just became a huge science fiction addict. And then, by, 3rd grade was once a week. My mom was taking me to the county library, and I would get a stack of about 7 adult science fiction novels and read one a day and return them. So my vocabulary is pretty decent, better than the average engineer, I guess.
Yeah. That's fantastic. Yeah, pre Star Wars. I mean, Star Trek, I think it was still pretty I had a conversation recently with Ben Yallow about the impact of Star Trek on the growth of science fiction fandom, and I think that had an impact for sure. But you know, the original series is still pretty camp, still pretty
Yeah.
ghetto looking. You know, it's to get a sense of like how Star Wars, by which I mean Episode 4, the only true Star Wars, how
Right.
how it changed the game. You have to kind of watch like Logan's Run
Hmm.
was what big budget science fiction was understood to be right before that, and like Star Wars is just completely in a different league. And then
Yeah.
and then you look at the imitators of Star Wars and you see things like Star Crash or The Battle Beyond the Stars, and you're like,
Yes. Yes. That's a
after
classic one.
Lucas, they still couldn't do it, you know?
Right. So, 2 points there. One is again, sort of speaking to the youth. When I'm talking the story, 1979 or so. You correctly point out, like, hey, Star Trek had already existed. Yeah,
Yeah,
but today you're curious about anything. You look up the absolute most obscure science fiction thing from 1952 or 79, and you just stream it on YouTube or you get it from wherever. This
sure.
is back in sort of Werner Vinge in one of his books had the unthinking depths, and it was in what a Fire Upon the Deep. And the 1970s were the unthinking depths. It was before the information age. So there were 3 networks on TV and 9 stations of
Uh,
static. And if something was not on before your childish bedtime of 8 p.m. or 9 p.m., I knew for years that there was something called Space 1999. But, the reruns of
sure.
this weird British show were on at, 10 p.m. So it didn't really exist. But yeah, getting back to big budgets, one thing that was really great about Star Wars and then later Battlestar Galactica was this lived-in universe. Alien had the concept of blue-collar universe, and that's a similar thing.
Yeah,
But it wasn't, just sort of spray-painted silver and smooth, and sort of Robin Hanson, the Economist, talks about, near mode and far mode. And in far mode, everything is sort of abstract and idealized. So, the communists, when they were, preaching to the peasants in the 1920s, had this far mode. Oh, in the future, pure communism, everything's perfect. But the problem is we don't live in this world of platonic ideals and abstractions. We live in an
right,
actual world. So
right.
yeah, Star Wars was cool because it brought you into an actual world.
The spaceships looked dinged up and
Hmm.
dirty, and
Yep.
you know, they made uncomfortable noises, right? Like they're like battered semi trucks or something. Yeah, absolutely fantastic. Man, I this point about like the difference of the I don't know, the availability of pop culture. This is so interesting. This has been brought home with me to me with respect to music by my kids. So I drove cross country from Utah to Chattanooga and back to go to LibertyCon, I don't know, a month ago or something. Took my daughter. And so the deal is we'd kind of trade off whose music we're listening to. And her music had a huge chunk of, she's 17. Uh, Kanye West, Yay, a bunch of Yay,
Yep.
a bunch
Yep.
of Doja Cat, a bunch of Michael Bublé, and then this just astonishingly small d diverse, diverse in time, diverse in style, from all periods. That would it would be like, here's an Elvis track, here's an ABBA track, here's an REO Speedwagon track, here's Steely Dan, right? Here's stuff not in English, I didn't know what it was. And you know, that music is all available electronically all the time, and there are tools that allow her to sort of be exposed randomly to stuff and say, "Oh, I like that," and pluck it, right? So it's interesting. It's sort of a there's something similar in publishing too. It's a
That's
container
I was
code.
about to say, either this is an act of synchronicity or you are like the most long-term planner, that you had your note cards about how you're going to steer this, because that's the perfect on-ramp to talking about sort of, on the one hand, the death of genre, but also the rebirth of micro genre and discoverability and everything.
Yeah,
So starting where you're talking about music, I've got my sort of quirky interests, and they say that people don't much discover new music after the age of 20 or so. So
mm,
I like 1970s progressive rock, crazy 60-minute long tracks with vocals by Geddy Lee and lyrics about starships and stuff.
yeah, of
Um,
course.
uh, and So it used to be that you'd have these sort of chunks, and culture would move on. So we had
Oh,
sort of the folk whatever 60s thing, then we had
yeah,
the 70s, the Eagles, and all these other bands. But now, on the one hand, you don't have that true joy of these microscopic hidden subcultures because everything is totally discoverable, and so you lose that joy of being in the know. It's just like the Cincinnati
right,
scene, and you wouldn't
right,
know because you're from Sacramento.
right. A
But on the other
secret
hand,
language, a
yeah,
code.
but on the other hand, it's all going in parallel. So, if somebody, and we can turn this right into a perfect plug for ARC. Say you're like me, or like you, and you grew up, reading 60s and 70s and 80s science fiction, and you just love Larry Niven and Pornell,
Yeah,
and Mona Lisa Overdrive, and cyberpunk, and all these things. Genres peak in popularity and they disappear, at least at global scale.
yeah,
But now, if someone goes to Barnes and Noble, and like this is me over the last, I used to love Barnes and Noble. It's my second home. And you'd go in there, and there's always something new by a bunch of my favorite authors. Larry Niven, or China Mayville, or Ken
yeah,
McLeod, or John Barnes is a particular favorite. And
yeah.
I've also been lucky enough that he's a bit of a mentor and a friend now. But that
Very
whole
cool.
scene is dead, and there's nothing but female and sort of gender acronym approved people from Tor,
Yeah,
publishing sort of cozy fantasies about lesbian orc coffee house owners, and
yes,
that's not even a joke. I mean, that's a literal title.
I know
And
it.
it is absolutely amazing that ARC has sprung into existence and is saying, you like Jerry Pournelle military science fiction from the 1970s. And it's like, what is that movie with John Cusack in the record store?
Oh, high fidelity.
High Fidelity, yes.
Yeah,
Based on a book, and the book is good too.
yeah, yeah.
And
Nick somebody. Shoot, I should remember. Anyway,
yeah.
yeah.
And so, you've
Hornby.
got, yes, I was about to say, but I didn't want to say it in case I was wrong. So I was risk averse
I
there,
think
and I
it's Nick
apologize.
Hornby. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I agree. So we've got you, behind the counter, maybe in the role of Jack Black, saying, "Oh, you like Jerry Pournelle? Well, let me turn you on to some Larry Correa, and let's do a needle drop
Yeah,
on that." Or
yeah,
someone walks in and says, Heinlein, well, unfortunately Heinlein's dead, but Corcoran is around,
yeah,
and
yeah,
so. And that's sort of what Passage is doing too, bringing back the sort of very small niche. But a lot of these niche, which had their moment in the sun 5, 10, 12 years, didn't need to die, didn't need to go away, because there's a lot of really fascinating work to be done. So that's why I'm so enthused about ARC.
yeah. It's so interesting. If we kind of expand out a little bit and think about the scene, right? It is a consumer's paradise in that everything. So it used to be, right? You talk about B. Dalton, Walden Books, right? Barnes. I didn't hear. I saw Barnes and Noble first. I think I was like 18 years old. B. Dalton and Walden were the ones who were around,
Mm-hmm.
and so the books that were available for purchase, the universe of books I was ever going to buy, were the ones there.
Yeah.
And actually the college had a really great science fiction selection. There was a guy who worked there for 50 years who was absolutely fabulous about SFF. So that was it. Those are the books I knew of. Those are the books I was conceivably going to buy, right? Book came off the shelf there. Basically, it ceased to exist for teenage me, right?
Yep.
Um, or it became a thing that'd be very hard to find. Um, Nothing goes out of print anymore
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because print on demand technology, because you don't have to print a thousand or 10, you don't have to print any at all. You can make it
Mm-hmm.
available as an ebook.
Right.
Um, and you can, and you, the rights holder, which maybe is like the grandson of the author, or you're the author, whatever, you don't even need distribution the way that historically it's been understood, because Amazon and similar channels will do it, right? So you can create stuff. And by the way, once things go off copyright, there are all kinds of little companies out there that are basically taking things that were out of print and out of copyright and making them available again. So, nice editions of Winnie the Pooh and Degas and wait, Degas is a painter. Who am I thinking of? Three Musketeers.
Dumas.
Dumas. Wow, Degas, hilarious. Yeah, right. Like, in other words, once upon a time, a book competed against the books in the bookstore, but now the competition for sales grows by the minute, right?
Mm-hmm.
Paradise for the consumer, right? Um, for the producer, it's tough. And so I love this analogy to the movie High Fidelity. I think it's a great way to think about ARC as a way to say, look, um, because a shop like that is idiosyncratic, right? It's idiosyncratic to Jack Black, to the owner, to the guys who are running it. You're not necessarily going to find any record in there. If you want any record, you can go find it on Amazon, right? You can go order it from Tower Records or whatever. This is a little shop that's sort of idiosyncratic to the people who are running it. And that's kind of, I think it's an interesting way to think about ARC. Like, look, hey, the problem we're going to try and solve for you, the reader, is you don't have infinite time trying to find stuff that's good or that's interesting to you, right? Um, so we're going to curate a catalog and have stuff that is interesting. And it's not all going to be the same. We'll tell you clearly what it is. So like if you like hard science fiction, but you hate fantasy, cool. Here's this Travis J.I. Corcoran novel. If you're the other guy, well, we got this Larry Correa novel over here we want to talk to you about, right? But all in the context of that kind of like little funky, not aiming for the mainstream aesthetic, aiming for the aesthetic of the people who are running it, you know.
Slightly musty smell and weird clientele, but
That's what we're
that's where
aiming
you go for this esoteric stuff. Um,
Correct. The musty smell, the creaking floorboards, the honking of the city bus outside.
you're like a junkie, right? You're like, yeah, this is the good stuff. I can tell I'm
That's
close to it
right. A
now.
homeless guy staggers into the front door. I'm in the right place.
Right.
No, I think that's a good way to think about us. We're man, maybe someday. In theory, we'd love to be Random House.
Mm-hmm.
That's a long way away. What we're going to
Mm-hmm.
be long before we're that is a little shop putting out an idiosyncratic range of books that we like. And this is, by the way, also why we put ourselves out so much in social media is to not be mysteries. So you can go, oh, that's who Dave is. That's the stuff he likes. If I think that's basically simpatico, you know, that'll give me a view about the books, right?
So on this topic of putting yourself out on media,
Yeah,
this is like another really big change from say 1975 to 2025.
yeah.
And in the same way, I have to explain to kids like what a dial-up phone was and like what a
Oh yeah.
payphone was. This concept that authors and publishers and readers are all in the same space, and you can be on Twitter and ask one of them a deep probing question about a character motivation, or call them a faggot because something, right?
Right.
It's all there face
Yes.
to face. And it used to be this sort of huge sort of gap in prestige and distance and
Yeah.
formality. And I remember in the 70s reading a book, and books were often hardcover in libraries, and they had dust jackets, and it was sort of pro forma or de rigueur that the back flap would have a formal portrait of the author. There in his
Yeah.
jacket, his pipe,
Sitting.
right? And Robert Heinlein attended at the Annapolis Naval Academy in 1929 through and he's written this and that.
Yeah.
And these people were sort of in a different realm. And it was, of course, theoretically possible that if you took a bus to some city and went downtown, that you could bump into Heinlein or Isaac Asimov or something. They were, in fact, in the same physical, three-dimensional universe, but not in the same cultural universe. And now we're all sort of, literally peer-to-peer in social media. And it's
Yeah.
interesting. It's weird.
Yeah. It is interesting. And actually science fiction fandom may have been out ahead of the culture
Mm,
or out ahead of the technology on this, right? In that for a lot of years, this was the beauty of going to something like Worldcon, is that Heinlein would be there,
right.
and
Amazing. Um,
more or less approachable. I mean, within the context of you're there with like 500 other people, right?
right.
Um, but yeah, I think the culture generally is caught up, and you see actors and politicians along with yeah, writers, and have their own social media channels. Yeah, 100%. It's an interesting
So,
little.
on the topic of running to Heinlein at a convention, there
Oh
is a
yeah.
story which I'm sure you've heard 100 times, but I've heard it and I love it. So, here comes number 101. The Forever War was what Joe Haldeman. And
Yeah.
just 10 seconds of background. Heinlein wrote Starship Troopers, and Heinlein had been in the military, but he was invalided out with emphysema or something, and so he did not fight in World War II. And Haldeman had been growing up a huge Heinlein fan, and then actually went to Vietnam, and he was an enlisted grunt there, I believe, even in the infantry. And he appreciated the idealism that Heinlein presented in Starship Troopers, but also had a sort of cynical take of like, yeah, that's the marketing literature, but you get down in the mud and the incentives are stupid and the officers are sometimes stupid, sometimes venal, or just sometimes don't know what they're doing through no fault of their own. And so he wrote effectively a response to Starship Troopers, which was Forever War. And he was
Interesting.
proud of what he'd done, but he was also thinking, like, the great man Heinlein, the dean of science fiction. In some sense, I have taken his thing and I have said, no, it's wrong. F you, raised middle finger. And so he's at Worldcon or something, and he sees Heinlein, and Heinlein sees him, and he sees that he sees him, sort of thing. And Haldeman sort of freezes up, and Heinlein like beeline straight towards him, and he thinks, is this it? Am
He's
I
gonna
going to get
kill
knocked out in the middle of Worldcon by Heinlein? And Heinlein strode right up to him and, said, Haldeman, and stuck out his hand. That was an amazing novel. That was a great, sort of rejoinder and everything, which, is just a wonderful story about Heinlein. And,
Yeah.
this dirty, filthy, hippie kid can disagree with him. But Heinlein's like, no, that is a strong, valid interaction with my point of view. And this
Yeah.
is, literature. There's a great phrase I love. Literature is in conversation with itself. So you
Yes.
can't write science fiction in 2025 without, to some degree, knowing about, sort of media literacy from, calling from inside the house. You
Yeah.
understand that Asimov existed and Heinlein existed, and everything that you write is inherently reacting or dealing with that. And that's always an interesting way to look at novels and think, what are his influences? What is he saying? How is he agreeing and disagreeing with so and so?
Yeah. Boy, this 100%. Literature is an ongoing conversation. There's so many directions we can go from here. I mean, one is the challenge of canon in the context of books that are published, just expand every single day. And by the way, there is political argument over writers. I mean, everybody up until yesterday, they're all racists from certain points of view, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
uh you know I guess my basic thought is it's that's just to some extent that's the challenge. Like a to really be in the canon, you have to not only you have to sort of be aware of Asimov or Philip K. Dick or whoever, like actually the canon goes back to the Greeks and the Hebrews, and so there's a lot you need to be have some familiarity with, while at the same time dealing with the challenge that there's just no way you can master it all, right? Especially if you are like most of us making a living some other way. You weren't born rich and able to immerse yourself in your texts.
Right.
You weren't taught Greek by your father at the age of 6 or
So,
whatever.
so as a side note, right, we would all love to have a trust fund so that we could, dabble in the world of science fiction 40 hours a week. I find it absolutely hilarious that of all of those people who did have a trust fund, it was Larry Niven, the one MFer who could have supported himself off his absolutely titanic bestsellers and everything. And
Yeah,
so I don't know.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
funny.
Life's life's not fair. I actually so this is not have the same kind of interesting highbrow kind of resonances. But I met Pornell. This goes to the point of the accessibility of people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't online. I was at a science fiction convention, and this was shortly before COVID. Might have been 2019, or maybe it was 2018. It was like a week before he died. So whenever Jerry Pornell died, it was a week before that. And I was standing at it is in a hotel suite that was, it was a bar, right? And bunch of drinks, pizzas on the tables and stuff. And I was standing in the counter with Jim Mintz, who was a Baen editor, and Jerry Pornell was there, kind of holding court. And at a certain point, he stands up and walks over to me, and he says, "Oh, you're not the guy I thought you were." And then he proceeds to talk to me for several hours,
Nice.
and just sat there and unloaded story after story. Yes, about who wrote book what in response to this story over here, but also who was sleeping with who, and right, fights behind the scenes. It was delightful. So yeah, I favor I have a strong small L libertarian streak. It's a complicated world. It is a hard world for a producer, but it's a wonderful world for the reader, and I think that's a great, net. I think that's to be desired.
So this, like any conversation, any good conversation, is like
Yeah,
spawning off sort of neutrons that are triggering more reactions faster than you can actually linearly catalog them.
yeah,
So you there's at least three things. One was you used the word libertarian. I want to touch on that. Two, you used the word, or you talked about a long conversation with an author, and three, you talked about the canon, how it goes back to the Greeks. Um, Hopping across these in some random order. So I mentioned I'm in the New Hampshire State House.
yeah,
I consider myself an anarcho-capitalist,
yeah,
which is a extreme form of libertarian, but I'm registered as a Republican, as most of the libertarians and anarcho-capitalists in New Hampshire are.
sure.
So, for those who, I wouldn't say that I'm a member of the Free State Project, but for those who are vaguely aware of it, like New Hampshire has some libertarian thing going on up there. 1/4 of our state house is pretty hardcore libertarian, not like libertarian inclined. I'm like, Bitcoin, nuclear energy, 0% taxes if we can get it. So that's quite something.
Yeah,
But I also have a lot of interest in NRX, which is the term for near reaction. And so, anyone who knows Passage Press and, Curtis Yarvin on Zero HP Lovecraft and everything. So we're not talking about my book today, but my first two novels, the Aristillus series, were a very, let's talk about anarcho-capitalism. Let's weave that through everything. Let's talk about it is wrong. Let's engage in a plot that calls these facets to the forefront and really explores them.
yeah,
Red State Mars, which we're mostly not talking about today, goes deep and sort of digs into near reaction, and sort of the different facets of it and how those facets are to some degree cooperative and to some degree
yeah,
in conflict. There is a famous JPEG meme, whatever you want to call it, floating around, which is a Venn diagram of three subtribes of near reaction. One
oh,
is theonomists, which is to say sort of the religious right.
yeah,
Another is the ethno-nationalists,
mhm,
and a third one is the techno-commercialists.
oh,
And this was, this JPEG, I think it was formalized, but it was originally from a post in a Spangel blog like 15 years back. And if you look at things like Trump and the MAGA right, and also Elon Musk, and also some sort of executives in Silicon Valley, you can see these factions all in this sort of three-way tug of war. And so I think that near reaction, and of course, Moldbug being influential on Thiel, and Thiel being influential on both Musk and Trump. These ideas are in the water these days.
yeah,
So that's something I'm proud about. This novel isn't merely the superficial surface story of a bunch of laser battles and drones,
yeah.
etc. But it's exploring these intellectual currents.
It's got ideas. Yeah, fantastic.
Thanks. So that was one, which is libertarianism. Two, you were talking about author stories. I've gone to a few science fiction conventions. I went to Aresia once. I went to WriterCon. ReaderCon once or twice,
Hmm.
and I've gone to BasedCon, which is done by my
Over in
friend Rob
Michigan or whatever.
Persky. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
And if I can plug a third party, everyone should check out on Twitter Based, as in he's based.
right.
Based Con convention.
Yeah,
It is a small convention catering to sort of our type of people, old school science fiction with certain political tendencies, but it's not required.
yeah.
Um,
I like Rob.
and yeah, Rob's a great guy. And at ReaderCon, there is this science fiction author, Michael Swanwick, great author. And they have this feature at ReaderCon, which is Coffee Clutch, where you can sign up for 8 or 10 people, and you sit down with a writer, and the writer mostly freewheels. And so this was an hour-long session, and someone asked Michael Swanwick, do you have a new book coming or something? And his answer was yes. And someone else asked him something, and his answer was no. And third question, orange. And I asked him, in your novel, The Iron Dragon's Daughter, the dragon is named Melanchthon, which I looked up and is the name of a 16th century German theologian. What was the meaning about that? And Swanwick wrote up and just monologued for like 59 minutes, and it was amazing. I guess you were telling the story about Cornell. Writers are weird people, but it can be quite entertaining when you get them talking about something that they're interested in. And so speaking of monologuing, I've monologued 2 out of my 3 points. I'll put the third one on hold for a while, which is the canon and how it's 3,000 years old, and we can circle back to that later if we have time.
Yeah, we will for sure. The sort of the sort of discussion about the politics of the moment is super interesting. I'm aware of Yarvind. I think I've seen him, and of course Passage publishes his stuff. So in like some sense, I guess I'm affiliated with him. He doesn't have any influence on ARC's editorial, and I haven't seen him around, but I've encountered ideas that I think are similar to his, actually, first from an English philosopher who I want to say his name is John Gray, which I think is basically the same as the guy same name, not the same guy, same name as the different guy who wrote Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. I think was also named John Gray. So I hope I'm not getting the name wrong, because they're too but Straw Dogs is one of his books, and I read two or three of them. But his sort of basic argument is, hey, the enlightened, like all things pass, all political moments, political systems pass. The idea of an end of history, right, in which the destiny was that we were all going to get to left liberal democracy the whole world over, was a complete delusion. And it looks like that is basically passing now.
Yeah, the Fukuyama end of history kind of thing.
Yes.
So this gets onto one of my absolute favorite topics, because what you said is that vision is passing. I mentioned John Barnes. Weirdly, like 90% of my favorite science fiction writers are hard left. Sure. So maybe I'm disloyal.
Also.
Yes, exactly right. I mean, literal a communist, as I understand. I think Ken MacLeod, Scottish SF author, no longer calls himself a communist, but you might need sort of lab grade equipment to understand the difference between him and the actual reference standard, right? The emissions line has shifted a little bit left right here. And so John Barnes, in a interstitial essay in a collection of short stories, and I stumbled across this like 20 or 25 years ago, talked about this concept, and I'm going to mangle the pronunciation, but like chondriative waves. And there is this slightly fringe theory in sort of finance, but also sociology, that there are sort of unseen mechanisms, not in a spooky spiritual sense,
right.
But like, why exactly do fashions come and go? And the answer is that to some degree they get out, they saturate the market. Why do genres come and go, right? I mean, family sagas were a genre from 1973 to 1983, and then they disappeared. Sure. Horror was a genre for 10 years, then it disappeared, then it came back. And something gets out there, its novelty to some degree wears off, it saturates the market, it goes away, and like cicadas or something on this cycle, the environment needs to sort of reset itself, except in this case it's the mimetic or the social environment. And so there are business cycles, and there's a 1-year cycle and a 2-year cycle, and things like more and more credit gets extended, but then they get overextended and leveraged. So there's the somewhat fringe theory of, yes, everyone knows there's a 1-year cycle, a 3-year cycle, a 7-year cycle. Might there be longer cycles, perhaps in the business world, but also there's the statement that science advances one funeral at a time. Might we be ready for certain breakthroughs, but the senior scientists who are occupying chairs at universities aren't willing to listen to the younger, grad students, et cetera. And at a cultural level, might a certain idea fully saturate a culture, run out of steam? And this is something that Moldbug has talked about in his blog. Countries aren't overthrown, they collapse because they're exhausted. So I'm going to take these cycles, and this is a theory that I don't know if anyone else has seen. I think I perceive a 500-year cycle, which is we had the Roman Republic lasted for, hand-wavingly 500 years until it turned into the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire lasted for hand-wavingly 500 years. We had sort of the earlier low medieval age, you get up to sort of 1500 or so, you get the Enlightenment. And so I have been wondering for about 20 years, like, are we seeing the end of the 500-year cycle of the Westphalian nation state? And, I look around and Europe is exhausted and they can't do anything. And you say, okay, what is the Irish stance on this? And the answer is, well, which do you mean? Do you mean the ethnic Irish who are rioting on this side of the street? Or do you mean the Muslim Irish who are rioting on this side of the street? And you say, is the word Irish no longer as relevant as it was? And so I am very open-minded to the hypothesis that our entire civilization, worldwide, is going through a phase change. And the last one I would say was the birth, was the printing press, the birth of Protestantism, and the rise of the Westphalian nation state. And, if you look forward, what is the printing press? It's like a really slow, pathetic version of the internet. What is, the Westphalian nation state? It is cultures that are geographically unified because information moves at the speed of a horse. So a subculture can only be 300 miles across left to right. So that's another thing that I think is a fascinating big picture topic that science fiction can explore.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Do you know Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions? Is that?
I do. I've got my copy about 10 feet away right over there.
Mine's right over there. So what a great book. I do think that science basically, look, people imagine that science is a bunch of objective, altruistic-minded people looking for truth. It is nothing could be further from reality. It is a bunch of pimp-rolling Mac daddies with knives who will stab each other in the back to get at the top of the festschrift or to have the chair or run the conference. And so this idea that, like, look, when does the paradigm change? When the old guard is broken.
Yep.
When there's enough people are convinced by the new thing and the old guard is broken. It isn't even the idea. It's there's a social thing. And
absolutely.
So it absolutely could be, there could be an analogous kind of, and I have not read any of the Mencius Goldbug stuff. So maybe I'm just repeating Curtis Yarvin without realizing it. But like you could imagine something similar socially where, in fact, I think arguably we're seeing things like this where the cultural heights, right? The sort of old prestige platforms, media channels, professorships, whatever, are still holding on to yesterday's, consensus, right? While beneath them, the young and the agile and the desperate and the poor and the people who are making change today actually have, maybe it's a Hegelian synthesis with a new thing. Maybe it's an abandonment of the old thing entirely.
I 100% agree with you. And just as a quick aside, you were saying, science is not a pure truth-seeking activity. It is a greedy, corrupt, money and laudatory seeking institution. And there are so many things where, as sort of an idealist in my 20s, I was pushing back against these left-wing orthodoxies. And one of them is like, science isn't objective. Science is serving those in power. And I'm like, no, that's so wrong. Science is objective. And now I'm 50 and like this, radical right-wing ANCAP. And I'm like, science isn't pure. Science is a greedy, disgusting thing that serves those in power. And what I mean by that is sort of the, Obama, Biden, transnational, elite, et cetera. And you can just look at, papers and say this. And as a quick aside, one of my favorite follows on Twitter is Literal Banana. And the avatar is a literal banana with hands and legs. And Literal Banana does deep dives on scientific papers because you can get anything from scihub.ru. And I started poking at papers, 20 years ago or so, when you could first get them online. And it was amazing because, like, you just pick a random paper. Someone is talking, New York Times reports on a new global warming thing. So you click, you finally get a copy. And the paper is garbage. It was presented with such certainty. And, a common thing is, we did a model of the complete world, but we only had 17 data stations. So we interpolated a perfect mesh of 10,000 data stations that crosses the ocean on a perfect XY grid. And you realize, like, garbage in, garbage out, nothing actually happened here.
Right.
So, yeah. And then another thing I want to mention, there is a business book from 25 years ago called The Innovator's Dilemma. And
Clayton Christensen.
Yeah, okay, great. And so the Innovator's Dilemma in sort of capsule form is like your IBM. You make really good mainframes, and you have the customers you are already selling these mainframes to. And these, you have now locked yourself into a worldview where you only listen to them, and you ask them, what new features do you want? And they say, instead of 32 simultaneous data connections, we want 64. And I, as IBM, go back and say, could I double the price if I deliver them? They're like, yeah, sure, of course. We're American Express. Price is no object. And so you do this, and you lock yourself in, and you start climbing the value tree. Meanwhile, out in, California, in garages, Steve Wozniak is playing around with this like cheap $30 6502 chip. And the 6502 will be a garbage computer in the first generation, the Apple One. It'll be better in the 2. It'll be better in the 2 Plus. It'll be better in the 2E. And so you are always getting eaten from below by these scrappy insurgents. So this ties in a little bit to the meme of when the mandate of heaven, is in the gutter, don't be surprised who picks it up. So if you look around at our elites, they're climbing this greased pole to appeal to ever more esoteric subsets of weird university gender theorists with what is the word for you can't get fired? Tenure.
Tenure, yeah.
And meanwhile, and so they're in this little courtiers, I don't know how the word is pronounced, at the palace, talking to each other, and they're ignoring the fact that you've got this generation of 20 and 30-something-year-old young men who feel disillusioned, who don't believe in this culture, and they can't see it. It's like, right before a revolution. It's amazing.
That's super interesting. So there's a product development analogy too, right? In what you're setting out, which is fantastic. The thing that innovates and eats your lunch is that when you get yoked to the top dollar customer, you don't see the scrappy innovator from below, whose version is objectively not as good as yours.
Right.
It's good enough, and it does the thing that a larger number of people want.
Right. Exactly.
And so, yes, politically, culturally, are there, I think millions of people, tens of millions of people, globally, hundreds of millions of people who are not being heard? I think the answer is yeah. So I think we're at this moment, whether the fourth turning model is correct or not, it's that look, there's an epoch we've lived in, and in America, that is government by bureaucracy, by regulatory agency, by white collar class, right? And the white collar rotates in and out of these jobs and in and out of government, and they're the real government. Who's elected only matters in as much as someone is willing to really fight against the real powers, which are the people who can get your agenda done, who can get you funding, who also maybe can assassinate you, right? Because we're talking about Central Intelligence Agency and others. And I think that's the thing in the US. Elsewhere, it looks different. Although I think the UK is pretty similar, actually. I think their civil service and they call them quangos, which is quasi-autonomous, non-governmental organizations. Same thing. It's USAID, it's NGOs, right?
I was about to say, the US and Canada are just mini-me's. And basically the entire Western world was, conquered militarily, politically, philosophically, culturally, et cetera, by the West, between 1945 and 1955. So there is no, there's perfect correlation. And it was the Black Swan guy, Nassim Taleb.
My copies of his books are right over there.
Awesome. And he said something, I'm going to paraphrase poorly, but like, in a crisis, all correlations go to one.
Yeah.
And so what he's getting at is, if you're on an ocean liner, you say, okay, we've got statistics. The engine goes out once every 1,000 years. The water desalinization unit goes out every 1,000 years. The radio goes out, right? But if you hit a iceberg or a leftover World War II mine, all of those things go wrong at the same time. And you want to say, as a naive, dumb statistician, that's impossible. Each of them is supposed to be, but no, they're correlated because they're all blowing up together. And
Yeah.
so the problem with the Western world is there are not, in fact, 100 different countries, each uncorrelated. I'm not arguing that like Zog is, forcing Canada to do this, but it's a
Right.
monoculture. And
Sure.
so, we had Black Lives Matter and England, which, didn't have anything like our history of slavery. They had 50
Right.
or 100. They've got BLM because they don't understand that they're not an American state. They think we're an American state. Why aren't our votes being counted in November? And so, yeah, so the interesting thing about this, the bad thing about a totally correlated monoculture is it means that the entire West can fall to one invasive,
Yeah.
who's the
Like a virus.
Gramscian,
Yeah.
takeover, long march
Yeah.
through the institutions. But the good news is that the sort of revolution from below, it only has to topple one regime because it's the same regime.
Yeah. Yeah. Super, super interesting. Yeah. So we're in this moment, I
Yeah.
think. And this is, another way to see ARC is we want to sort of find people who are writing on behalf of ideas and values we agree with. And some of them might be sort of pushing us in new and interesting directions. They might be, anarcho-capitalist or otherwise sort of radical. And like some of them will definitely feel reactionary to some people. I mean, I know they
Mhm.
will, right? Because if you tell a story in which the nuclear family is given, is given value, and not the found family, like that
Mhm.
is radical reactionary, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so we'll see where we go now. It's interesting.
This ties back to the Heinlein versus Haldeman thing.
Yeah.
And which is meeting speech with more speech, which is I'm intentionally echoing sort of a Enlightenment ideal. And on the one hand, I think that a 500-year cycle of the Westphalian nation state is ending. But on the other hand, I love the Enlightenment, and a lot of people on the right, will argue with me. They're like, no, the Enlightenment is what brought us to, inevitably step by step by step to drag queen story hour. And I
Right.
see the argument, I see the steps they're laying, but I'm not willing to throw the Enlightenment baby out with the bathwater. And the idea of, you wrote a novel that I consider militaristic and, jingoistic. I'm not going to run up to you and punch you at a science fiction convention. I'm going to do my damnedest. I'm going to write 6 drafts if I have to write a better novel that argues the case back. So, I
Yeah.
try to engage with a lot of other authors' ideas. And, sometimes I agree and sometimes I disagree. Eric S. Raymond had a wonderful quote, and I thank him for it, talking about my Aristillus novels. And off the top of my head, it was something like, I've been waiting for decades for a book that both respects but seriously engages with Heinlein's ideas. Not slavish fanboyism. And I did that. I'm like, okay, I agree with Heinlein here, and I'm gonna punch him, or punch his ideas over here. And so I think Bain, where there's some cultural continuity with you guys there.
Yeah.
Bain was sort of famous for, we don't have the litmus test that Tor does. You
Right.
do not have to show your NRA card to publish here if you have
Right.
something interesting to say. And so, I think that's what is one of the best things about the history of science fiction, that it engages with ideas, and you can read, I forget his name, black gay author from the 60s and 70s wrote
Delaney.
Dogger and Samuel S. Delaney.
Yeah.
You can read Delaney and you can say, okay, I want to critique his ideas on, sexuality or found family. And you can just go off and write that book. And this
Yeah.
is not an insult to Delaney. That's how the game is played.
Right.
And so, I think that's wonderful. And I think that's what science fiction is at its very best.
Yeah. This was your take you just articulated here about the Enlightenment was exactly what John Gray was saying in these books. I can't remember. One of them has Leviathan in the title. I forget. But hey, the Enlightenment is going away. It behooves us to do what we can to make sure that the institutions that come next, whatever they
Mm,
are, uh, carry on or reinvigorate the best parts of the Enlightenment.
right.
That
Right.
that's the nature of his argument. Again, I have no idea what um what Dementia's Gold Bug stuff says.
Yeah, and so that's an interesting stance, and that sort of gets to sort of post-apocalyptic novels, Farnham's Freehold and Lucifer's Hammer and stuff. It gets to the Asimov ideas in Foundation, like this golden age is ending. Let's pack the lifeboat with the best of stuff so that we can shorten the time of collapse or whatever. And so it is scary. There's the apparently apocryphal Chinese thing of may you live in interesting times, may you come to the attention of those in high
places. Is that
places.
not real? Disappointing.
I've heard both. I'm going to be like X-Files. I want to believe. And so I have in my own life come to the attention of those in high places, unfortunately. And I think I'm also, and you're, and everyone who's listening to this are living through interesting times. And this gets back to the chondriad of waves and other stuff with technology. Like the world seemed somewhat frozen between, 1990 and 2015, 2020. Like we got the internet and the World Wide Web, and that was pretty awesome. But the last time a Saturn V flew was 1973. The last space shuttle landed, more than a decade ago. And then suddenly, it feels like in 6 months. It was 10 years. But we've got, spaceships simultaneously coming down, making sonic booms and landing, just like in 1950s science fiction.
Crazy.
We've got large language models and other things happening. So I don't know. It feels like history has gotten really unstuck for good and for ill. I think it's going to be a scary ride over the next 50 years.
I think it's going to be a scary ride. Yeah, I think that's real. That's really good. It felt like for 20 years, but I think it was longer than that. But like from the onset of the internet, it felt like all of the investment went into finding more ways to screw cash out of people's personal data.
Yes. And so this ties into the innovator's dilemma a little bit, that there's this thing in software called a hill climbing algorithm, where if you sort of picture fitness or return on investment or whatever as a two-dimensional graph where success is the z dimension, and if you're some sort of business, you're a plumbing business or something, you just try, hey, let's advertise here, advertise here, advertise here. They each had different feedback. This thing worked best, so you do more of that, and then you try a few more experiments. And this is sort of at a pullback conceptual level. You are climbing whatever hill you're on and absolutely optimizing, but you're becoming a bit like a Darwinian finch, being the absolute best finch for that particular island. Yeah. And so the internet was hugely profitable and e-commerce was hugely profitable. But how many, hundreds of thousands of man years, millions of man years, how many, perhaps literally trillions of dollars were invested in making the conversion funnel at eBay 2% more lucrative, the robo signing mortgages just a little bit better, and now we're building spaceships and we're training AIs.
This is Elon Musk is like, for my money, is the MVP of the first half of the 20th century. There are other people who are hugely influential, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Like him or not, Donald Trump has had a really big effect.
Yes.
But Elon Musk was the guy who said, I have made a fortune. I'm now going to go stake my personal fortune, skin in the game, right? This is entrepreneurial capital. It's not the same as white collar capital. The bankers put my money. Kind of put his own money into, I'm going to die on Mars.
Right.
That's amazing.
Absolutely.
We throw around the adjective visionary for CEOs, and usually we mean somebody who's good at guessing consumer trends.
Right.
Musk has been a guy with an actually driven by a vision.
Yep. And so this also ties in, like, can you think of anyone like Musk or like Elon from the 1990s, from the 1980s? Like Reagan was somewhat visionary, but I think his star is somewhat fading. The 70s, the 60s, JFK, the 50s going back. I think you can only get larger than life figures in certain inflection points in history.
That's probably right. Or maybe we only get them in the sense that they come to our attention. So that maybe that the people who were larger than life were just engaged doing other things because
right. Yeah. We're on the same page. And this is, I remember a conversation I had, I think with my dad decades ago, talking about the founders, Jefferson and Adams and Washington. And I was saying, how amazing that these 5 or 10 or whatever geniuses all just happen to be in the same place and time. And this gets into the great man of history versus sort of the forces of history. When the forces of history are like that, they're never going to pick a random schlub who dropped out in ninth grade or something and elevate him. Oh, actually, maybe that's not even true, right? I'm thinking about some of our early presidents and stuff. But when times are normal, everyone gets jobs turning the crank, producing a few more widgets, doing this and that. And so these potential geniuses are just, geniuses doing a desk job. But when times get really weird, the Trumps and the Musks and other people are elevated and are seen to change the world.
Yeah. Yeah. Super interesting. Super interesting times. Super interesting times. We haven't talked about canon yet, but we also haven't really talked very much about you, because this was going to be like a meet Travis Corcoran. No, but this is great. It turns out that it's meet Travis Corcoran as a guy having a philosophical driving conversation, such as you might at the bar at Worldcon or whatever.
There's a thing. First of all, there's a community on Twitter, the rationalists, and I was never a rationalist nor near them. In my opinion, the smarter of the rationalists broke away from that blog or website or essay site and formed a ill-defined group, the post-rationalists, and then the concept of the post-rationalist culture became legible and started getting invaders. So the post-rationalists, and this is like a James C. Scott. James C. Scott is a now deceased Yale political philosopher, I think Yale, and he wrote a bunch of books, sort of The Power of the Powerless, the Seeing Like a State, Against the Grain, and he was doing sort of not just theory, but sort of sociology in the Southeast of Asia, saying, there's this constant tension between unifying, civilizing, taxing forces like central governments and, sort of the Southeast Asian equivalent of rednecks who don't want to be, in sort of a 1960s sense, bent, folded, spindled, mutilated. And this is another concept that I've worked into Red State Mars. James C. Scott said that the Chinese, in one of his books, the Chinese have these terms for civilized people and uncivilized people. And the uncivilized are raw, like raw rice. And the civilized people are cooked. So this is one plot element in Red State Mars, the two different kinds of Chinese sort of pulling in tension on Mars and how that butts up against the different factions. And what in hell was I talking about before I went down this James C. Scott?
Rationalist, post-rationalist.
Right. So one thing, Scott, thank you. One thing Scott talks about is legibility. States always want things to be legible. They want you to have a social security number so they can find your income and tax it. They want you to have a single street address. They don't want Irish travelers wandering around with 3 different names. They randomly give authorities one name or another. And so you can see a lot of state institutions as being these sort of sense-making, number-granting, mappings of individual and productivity and land to each other with IDs, and just turning them into resources for the state. And so one thing that
Ataturk made everybody get a last name.
Exactly, right. Perfect example. And he also reformed the alphabet and did a variant of the Roman alphabet to sort of integrate them more with the Western economies. So if you look at peasant revolts, Asia, Ireland, England, Germany, whatever, one of the first things that peasants do is they burn the tax and the land records. And they throw off their last names. And then if they're really hardcore, they go into the hills and they renounce literacy. And you can even sort of watch TV shows like Justified set in Appalachia. And I live here in the northern end of Appalachia, and there is a thing in Asia, in America, in Europe. The hill people are always defiant and harder to govern, and these are the raw, not the cooked. So anyway, this part of Twitter found itself becoming too legible to outsiders and intentionally made itself illegible. People change usernames, etc. And that's I'm now out of my stack. We're running low on time, but next time we talk, we should talk about the canon, because I find that a hugely fascinating topic.
That's okay. Well, let's save that, because that is like a whole big conversation we could have. Look, this has been a terrific conversation.
Yeah,
Let us get a little more biography out
please.
of you. So, I think you said you lived 2 years in Missouri. That sounds like a childhood
Mississippi,
moving
yeah.
around. Were you like
Right. No,
military kid or something?
yeah, so I grew up in New Jersey,
Yeah.
and you go to college and say I'm from New Jersey, and everybody says, what exit? That's the joke. I grew up in the hills. The Appalachian Trail literally went through my town. Are somewhat suburban. It was actually a rural house backed up on a vast 1,000-acre forest. My version of New Jersey was not the
Yeah.
stereotypical one. Um, and yeah, business took my dad to Mississippi for 2 years when I was in second grade through fourth grade. Um, uh, like many sort of libertarian people, right? The report card always says doesn't play well with others,
Yes.
doesn't listen to the teacher.
Yes.
So that's been the defining characteristic of my life. I decided that I didn't care much for schooling. I loved learning, but I didn't care much for schooling. So I graduated high school early, went off to college. Still didn't care much for schooling at college, but did manage to get my degree there. Moved to Boston. I had one job offer in Nashua, New Hampshire back in 1993,
Right on the
one in the
border.
Pacific Northwest and one in Boston. I made the wrong choice. I went to Boston, and then that occupied the next 20 years of my life. And this is another tidbit to ensure that you invite me back because you want to ask about this. But after I got raided by the Joint Terrorism Task Force, I decided that I was going to
Oh,
leave Massachusetts. Um,
fantastic.
yeah. So I did. I moved to New Hampshire. And I like to give a little sort of pocket comparison of states that
Yeah.
I'm the same person. You can look this up on the Wikipedia page. Massachusetts decided that I needed to be raided by the JTTF, which is a combination of the FBI and the Massachusetts State Police. And New Hampshire decided that I was the kind of person who needed to be elected and sent to the state house. So those are two somewhat different political cultures.
Absolutely fantastic. So that would have been either like late Obama administration, or sorry, early Obama or late Bush administration.
2014, I think.
Oh, okay. All right.
2013, yeah, 4th of July, 2013.
Okay.
Um, and yeah,
Obama it is.
moved to the farm, and my wife and I had always each independently been interested in homesteading and sort of back to the land. And there's a whole other topic there. The younger listeners and viewers won't know this, but like during the hippie era, there was a back to the land movement. And, we're going to reject sort of capitalism and all of its devious ways. We're going to recover folk music. And so like the folk music scene of the 60s was tied in, intimately into this. We're going to go back to the land. The women aren't going to wear bras. The guys are going to grow their hair long, and they're going to do things old fashioned way. And then sort of how the tide has turned, my wife and I both grew up downstream with all of the little physical detritus of this movement. So every
Yeah.
library had a copy of, what was the book by Stuart Brand, the Whole Earth Catalog.
Oh yeah. Yep. Okay.
And so we found a great farm up here in New Hampshire, sort of overrun and invasive weeds, and needed a lot of fence. And we've been busting our asses for about 12 years, and it's looking pretty good now. We've got some orchards, we've got a herd of sheep, a lot of stuff fenced in. So when I'm not in the state house and I'm not writing science fiction and I'm not programming, I am, cutting down dead trees and splitting firewood.
That's fantastic. Another of your many claims to fame is that you kickstarted a book on smallhold farming, right?
Yes, yes.
2020 or 2021, maybe?
Yeah, right during COVID. So it was a back burner project. This talks about sort of like great men versus the currents of history versus,
Yeah.
times sometimes elevate a situation from what it would otherwise be.
Yeah, sure.
So I had been taking notes and working on this project. And there's a famous Heinlein quote, a human being or a man should be able to, compose a
All these lists
sonata.
of things: change a
Exactly.
diaper, prepare a
Right,
meal,
exactly.
comfort the dying.
On a ship, comfort the dying. And so one of them was butcher a pig.
Oh, but you got to say the last line: specialization is for insects.
Absolutely.
I love that quote. It's fantastic. Yeah.
And so I remind myself of that quote all the time when I'm looking at acquaintances and peers who don't know how to butcher a pig, but they are Google FANG employees, L5s or whatever, and they've got 20 million in the bank account, and I'm an author. I'm an author in my garret. You're an author and an editor in your basement, and I think neither one of us owns our own private island.
Yeah.
But so yeah, there is the moral victory of not being a specialized insect, or as the kids say these days, a bug man.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so I'd been working on this project on the back burner, and then COVID hit, and everyone was in lockdown, and I realized, holy crap, now is the time. But and the Heinlein quote I'd been intending to use as a title, how to butcher a pig. And I realized, okay, titles are part of marketing. Marketing is a really important thing. And so you need artistic integrity, you need your own vision, but you also compromise or take in feedback from the universe, and you're looking to discoverability and everything. And I realized, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, they're all running articles about people who are moving out of the city. And I said, that's it. That's the title of the book. It is now Escape the City. Put this Heinlein quote to the side. That would entertain me and six other, deep nerds. So the
Right.
title is Escape the City. I launched the Kickstarter. And, I shot video outside, wrote up a script. And the Kickstarter just absolutely exploded. My science fiction novel Kickstarter for Aristillus several years earlier had done on the order of $20,000. This Kickstarter did $100,000, and I took it over to BackerKit, did another 20 or so. So yeah, even before the book was finished, already had made 120, which is not a typical take on a book. And anyone say, "Hey, I'm suddenly interested in being an author," slow down.
Right. Yeah.
I got very lucky. Larry Correa talks numbers like that. The rest of us don't. Actually, Larry's probably talking better numbers. So yeah, but it was a lot of fun to write, and I have friends all the time on Twitter say, I had a question about garden hoses, or I needed to tap a hole, and then I realized, oh, it's going to be an Escape the City. Let me check the index. So that feels good every time someone tells me that.
That's very cool. There's Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations actually talks about the same thing. His comparison is between he talks about making pins. He says, what's the cheapest way to make pins? Well, it's absolute specialization. One guy just draws the pin out. He says one guy cuts the pin, one guy turns the head of the pin, one guy sharpens the point. He said, but that makes terrible people. You get much better people, and he talks about the plow. I think it's the plow boy or the plow man. But it says if you have to know how to operate the plow, fix the plow, recognize when the soil is right to do the plowing, how to do the planting, it's a much better human being.
Absolutely. So there's the concept that you're getting at, and quoting Adam Smith, which is talking about human flourishing, and what life would you rather have led? And when I'm 80, hopefully, God willing, or 85, looking back, or maybe with neural nets and new drug discovery, maybe when I'm 125, looking back. I would far rather have lived a life where I welded stuff, and every Christmas I built something for my wife in the workshop, and this and that, and wrote some books and did this, but never bought my own private island, than the guy who did make that money at a FANG, but didn't know anything other than sort of configuring Kubernetes.
And this is exactly right. If I had wanted to maximize my utils, as I learned in Econ 110, I would have stayed at the law firm, and I would have just billed as many hours as possible, and died.
Actually, I'm going to agree with your point, but quibble like a true nerd. I would say if you wanted to maximize your dollars, you would have done that, but you did in fact take the path that maximized your utils. It's just that dollars aren't the predominant
it's
thing.
Not in fact my currency. I asked very similar questions to you. Like, look, back, or when I'm dead, what would I want people to sort of think about me? What? Yeah, 100%. Wow, Travis, you are an interesting fellow. I am excited to have you on the ARC team.
And you're also fascinating. We've chatted a few times, and every time, like, oh, he was a lawyer. Of course he was a lawyer. That's just, of course, that's one footnote among 23. Why wouldn't he have been a lawyer?
So I escaped, though. Escaped the firm.
Right. Yes. I passed the LSAT, which is to say, I took a test one. I got a really good score, but then there's the invisible final question: is this what you want to do with your life? And I answered that question the right way, which is no, I don't want to be.
Yeah. Good job. Good job.
On the other hand, I've got a friend who's a lawyer, and every time he posts a picture from a helicopter with his Rolex showing, and the lines of Coke, et cetera, I'm like, well, I suppose beautiful women and Coke and helicopters, but that's not really my life. Mine is more rolling a tractor over and then getting out a lever jack and getting it back upright. So you
chose the better way. So your your first ARC novel will be out next year. So if someone wanted to start the Aristillus series, where should they buy that? What's the title of the first book?
So Amazon is the best place. The Aristillus series is right now 2 novels and 2 or 3 short stories, but there's a lot more mostly done behind the scenes that'll be coming out over the next couple of years. And it is, if you liked Heinlein's The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, this is a loving homage / expansion / 73 other tropes thrown in, exploration of a libertarian society on the moon with uplifted dogs and artificial intelligence and anti-gravity and very, very big weapons, fighting against sort of the UN peacekeepers in a socialist dystopian Earth in 2065. Amazon, and the first novel is titled The Powers of the Earth. And if you forget that, just remember it comes from the Declaration of Independence. And the second novel, the sequel, which wraps up that story with a pretty nice bow, is called Causes of Separation, which is, again, a phrase lifted from the Declaration of Independence. And then as a side note, and at the end of the second book, there is a long afterword where I ramble on about influences and sort of inside baseball, and this is a reference to that other novel. And so this is something that I was negotiating with Dave here 6 months ago when we were working on the contract. I said, we don't need to put this down in writing, and you will retain final whatever. But I would love it if there was a gentleman's understanding that I'm allowed to ramble an afterword. And Dave said, well, yeah, that sounds plausible. So we're not bound by that, but
I think it's unlikely to be a problem. I think that's right. Fantastic. Travis, look, thanks. I had a great chat.
As did I. I'm a morning person, not an evening person, and especially today, where for whatever reason I got up at 3:30 in the morning, and so normally, given that, like, oh my God, I'm still awake at 8. But this has been fascinating and invigorating. It's one of those conversations where, I mentioned the innovator's dilemma, and you're like, yeah, buy so-and-so. I've got my copy right over there. So it's always fun when you get to hang out with somebody and your ideas and influences really mesh like that. So thanks, and looking forward to be back on the show. And I am also really looking forward to getting the second and probably final draft of Red State Mars over the transom to you in about a week. And then the gears will start grinding for publication next year.
Yeah. It's in the works. It's in the works. And for those of us who have been listening, thank you. And remember that humans win in the end.